Every law on this list exists because someone died doing exactly what you would do. These aren't hypothetical warnings. They're the fine print written in the worst possible ink. Let's go. 1. The moment the shaking stops, the flood recedes, or the fire burns out, most people's first instinct is to go back in. Check the house. Grab the dog. Assess the damage. That instinct has killed people with depressing consistency, and dozens of laws now exist specifically to criminalize that instinct before it kills more. The legal concept of a post-disaster reentry restriction wasn't invented by bureaucrats trying to flex authority. It was invented by engineers and coroners who kept showing up to the same scene. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the initial ground movement killed people, but the fires that followed, fed by ruptured gas lines running through structures that looked intact, killed far more. Survivors who wandered back in became casualties in a disaster they thought was already over. California's Emergency Services Act now gives the governor explicit authority to enforce mandatory evacuation zones with criminal penalties ranging from misdemeanor to felony, depending on the circumstances. And those penalties exist because the alternative was a body count attached to a building that was already standing. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Louisiana codified re-entry restrictions so firmly that National Guard troops physically barred residents from returning to the lower Ninth Ward for weeks. This was not cruelty. It was engineers walking through structures that were still actively collapsing in slow motion. After the 2011 Joplin, Missouri tornado, multiple injuries occurred when residents re-entered the debris field before structural inspections were complete. Downed live power lines, walls that looked load-bearing and weren't, debris piles concealing voids that collapsed underfoot. FEMA's post-disaster protocols now include a formal tiered re-entry system, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, developed directly from documented fatalities during uncontrolled return. Several states enacted specific disaster zone trespass statutes after civilians repeatedly re-entered cordoned areas following major Florida hurricanes, sometimes triggering expensive emergency rescue operations for people who went back to check on property. Post-earthquake Turkey in 2023 documented dozens of secondary collapse fatalities among people who re-entered within 72 hours of the initial event. The pattern is identical across every disaster, every decade, every continent. The disaster doesn't clock out the moment you think it's finished. It just stops announcing itself and waits for you to walk back through the door. 2. If a building survives an earthquake while you're inside it, most people assume the hard part is over. The building stood. Therefore, the building is safe. Therefore, you can go back to work, or go home, or stop worrying. This assumption is so common, so logical sounding, and so consistently wrong that the legal definition of what earthquake-resistant actually means was specifically crafted to prevent you from ever being told the truth in plain language. The legal standard baked into United States seismic building codes, specifically ASCII 7, the reference standard used in virtually every jurisdiction, is called life safety. That phrase sounds reassuring until you understand what it actually means in engineering terms. It means the building is designed to remain standing long enough for the people inside it to escape. That is the complete and total goal. The building itself is legally allowed to be a total economic loss. It can be unsalvageable, unrepairable, and never occupied again. As long as it didn't pancake collapse while you were in it, the code worked exactly as intended. After the 1994 Northridge earthquake, dozens of modern code-compliant apartment buildings were immediately red-tagged, condemned, off-limits, uninhabitable, despite the fact that they were still standing. The engineers who inspected them were not surprised. The code had performed precisely as written. Japan's 1981 new seismic design standard, enacted after the 1978 Miyagi earthquake, revealed catastrophic failures in older construction, established a similar prevent total collapse threshold. But even that standard doesn't promise a livable building after a significant event. It promises a building that doesn't bury you on the way down. The 2011 Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake killed 185 people, partly in buildings that had passed pre-quake inspections. The Royal Commission investigation that followed led directly to laws requiring engineers to disclose in writing that code compliant does not mean safe to occupy after an earthquake. Many jurisdictions now legally mandate post-earthquake rapid assessment programs under a protocol called ATC 20, a law that exists specifically because residents consistently assumed upright meant safe. Los Angeles passed a mandatory soft story retrofit law in 2015 after modeling showed tens of thousands of compliant buildings would kill occupants in a major rupture. The building passed the test. The test just never mentioned that passing meant it was allowed to be completely destroyed. 3. If your home isn't in a FEMA-designated flood zone, not in the shaded area, not in the red, outside the lines on the official map, then you're safe. Flood insurance is for other people, the ones closer to the water, the ones the map flagged. This belief is not just wrong, it is wrong in a way that FEMA's own data makes embarrassingly clear, and the laws that followed have had to quietly acknowledge that the map they were built around was telling about half the country a comfortable lie. Approximately 40% of all flood insurance claims filed with the National Flood Insurance Program come from properties that are outside the designated high-risk flood zones, according to official maps. Not a few claims. Not an edge case. 4 out of 10 claims. From people the map said were fine. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 flooded more than 154,000 structures in Harris County, Texas. The overwhelming majority of those structures were located outside the 100-year floodplain as drawn on official FEMA maps. Congress passed amendments to the National Flood Insurance Program requiring more frequent map updates in direct response to Harvey because the maps failed at a scale too large to explain away. The core problem is that FEMA's flood maps are updated on a cycle that routinely runs 10 to 20 years behind actual conditions on the ground. Development changes everything. Parking lots, rooftops, and roads create impervious surfaces that dramatically increase runoff volume and speed, pushing water into areas that previous maps modeled as low risk. The Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 was partly motivated by the discovery that maps had been used for decades to suppress insurance requirements in areas where the political cost of accurate risk disclosure was deemed too high. After flooding disasters in Vermont in 2011 and again in 2023, state-level investigations found that FEMA maps had missed entire river-adjacent communities that experienced catastrophic damage. Several Gulf Coast states now legally require sellers to disclose a property's flood history, regardless of its current FEMA map designation. A law that exists because buyers were routinely purchasing homes without knowing the prior owner had filed multiple flood claims on a property the map said was not at risk. The map isn't lying to you with malicious intent. It's just running about 15 years behind the water, and the water doesn't care about the map's schedule. 4. When a wildfire approaches your neighborhood, the obvious move is your car. You have an engine. The fire doesn't. You leave. You survive. This is the plan. This is what common sense says. This is also, under specific and increasingly common fire conditions, how people ended up dying in gridlocked traffic while fire overtook the road around them, and why California rewrote its evacuation law in the aftermath. The 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise. California killed 85 people. A significant number of those deaths did not occur inside homes. They occurred in vehicles on evacuation routes, in gridlock, as fire moved faster than the road network could clear. The fire generated spot ignitions. Embers carried ahead of the main fire front, more than a mile beyond the fire line, and it did this within minutes, driven by wind gusts reaching 50 miles per hour. California passed Assembly Bill 3074 in 2020, requiring counties to establish enhanced defensible space requirements and develop community-wide evacuation plans with zone-based departure sequencing. That law was born directly from the Camp Fire gridlock deaths. The physics of the problem are fixed and unforgiving. Under extreme fire weather conditions, the combination of low humidity, critically low fuel moisture, and high wind that increasingly defines the worst fire events in the western United States. Fire spread rates of 10 to 12 miles per hour in brush and timber are documented. Most suburban road networks were designed for daily commute patterns, not simultaneous mass evacuation against a racing fire front. Australia revised its entire prepare, stay, and defend or leave early policy framework after the 2009 Black Saturday fires killed 173 people, a significant portion of whom attempted late vehicle evacuation. The revised legal approach effectively decriminalized departure before official orders and created financial incentives for early voluntary evacuation. A legal acknowledgement that the wait and decide model was producing a specific, predictable category of death. Several counties in California now have legal authority to implement contraflow highway operations during wildfire evacuations, a power modeled directly on hurricane evacuation law, enacted because standard traffic management creates bottlenecks that can turn an evacuation route into a trap. Insurance law in high fire risk zones is increasingly tying policy validity to evacuation order compliance. You thought you had a plan. The fire had a faster one, and it didn't need a road. 5. Every disaster movie has the same scene 20 minutes in. The disaster hits, and immediately someone is smashing a store window and walking out with a television. The law's job, the story goes, is to crush this swiftly and without mercy. Enhanced penalties, shoot to protect property orders, zero tolerance. The looters are predators, and disaster brings them out. This narrative is not only factually wrong about who is actually taking what from where, it has been written into law in ways that have directly produced documented deaths and convictions of law enforcement officers. In post-Katrina New Orleans in 2005, the Danziger Bridge shootings resulted in police officers firing on unarmed civilians, some of whom were attempting to reach food and medical supplies. Those officers were subsequently convicted of federal civil rights violations. The incident triggered federal oversight of the New Orleans Police Department and revisions to use of force law in declared disaster zones in Louisiana. Laws that exist because the crush the looters mandate had been applied to people walking toward groceries in a flooded city with no functioning government services. Florida's looting statute, enacted and substantially strengthened after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, carries mandatory minimum sentences regardless of the value of the item taken or the specific circumstances of the taking. It activates automatically upon a disaster declaration. After Hurricane Maria in 2017, Puerto Rico enforced curfews and looting statutes while tens of thousands of residents lacked access to clean water. Human rights organizations documented cases of individuals detained for taking survival supplies from damaged and abandoned commercial properties. Sociological research from the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware has consistently found that mass predatory looting during disasters is largely a myth. Documented post-disaster behavior skews overwhelmingly toward mutual aid, resource sharing, and improvised community response, rather than opportunistic theft. The myth has also been traced to racially biased reporting patterns. Several jurisdictions enacted laws after Katrina specifically protecting individuals from prosecution for taking necessity items from damaged commercial property during declared emergencies, a legal acknowledgement that the looting statute as written was being applied to survival behavior by people with no other options. The law decided what counted as stealing. It forgot to ask who was actually hungry when it drew that line. 6. Modern building codes are the product of decades of accumulated engineering knowledge, regulatory oversight, and public investment. Your house was inspected. The inspector had a license. The code was current. When the hurricane comes, you're covered. This is the version of events that several states sold to their residents for decades, while quietly building a catastrophic performance gap between the code and the storm. Florida did not have a statewide uniform building code until 2002. Hurricane Andrew struck in 1992 and killed 65 people while destroying 125,000 homes. The post-Andrew engineering investigation found not just substandard construction, but documented inspection fraud across Miami-Dade's construction industry. Contractors substituting non-compliant materials, inspectors signing off on work they hadn't examined, and an entire regulatory apparatus that had been functionally captured by the industry it was supposed to hold accountable. The Florida Building Code was the direct legislative consequence, and it took a decade after Andrew to enact it. The Miami-Dade Product Approval System, now one of the most stringent hurricane product testing requirements anywhere in the world, was created specifically because the post-Andrew analysis found that code-approved windows and doors had been routinely installed incorrectly or substituted entirely with non-compliant products, with no inspection catching either failure. After Hurricane Charley in 2004, analysis found that homes built to the new Florida Building Code still had significant failure modes, particularly at roof-to-wall connections. This finding led to additional code amendments mid-cycle, something that almost never occurs outside of post-disaster political pressure, overwhelming normal regulatory timelines. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Mississippi all substantially revised wind load requirements in their building codes after specific storm events. Not because the engineering knowledge was new, but because political resistance to stricter standards had previously blocked adoption of requirements that engineers had already recommended. Insurance companies operating in Florida began conducting their own post-construction wind mitigation inspections after documenting that municipal inspections were missing deficiencies that were producing total loss outcomes in Category 3 storms. State law was subsequently changed to recognize insurer inspections as legally relevant to policy terms. Post-Maria investigations in Puerto Rico found that decades of corruption in municipal inspection had left most structures in San Juan legally compliant on paper while being structurally inadequate in practice. The code was the floor, not the ceiling. In some places, someone forgot to install the floor. 7. Dams are massive, regulated infrastructure. There is obviously a federal agency watching them. There are obviously regular inspections. Someone is obviously in charge of making sure they don't fail and kill the people downstream of them. This sounds correct. It is not even close to correct, and the legal vacuum at the center of American dam safety has been documented in body counts for more than a century. The United States has no federal dam safety law with mandatory enforcement authority over the majority of its approximately 91,000 dams. The National Dam Safety Program Act exists, but it primarily provides funding and technical assistance to state programs. It does not grant federal authority to compel repairs on privately owned dams, which constitute the majority of structures in the national inventory. The 1972 Buffalo Creek flood disaster in West Virginia, a coal slurry dam collapse that killed 125 people, forced federal attention toward dam safety and produced provisions in subsequent water resources development legislation. But even the post-Buffalo Creek legal framework left enforcement almost entirely at the state level, where capacity varies from robust to non-existent. The Association of State Dam Safety Officials documents that approximately 2,300 high-hazard dams, defined specifically as dams whose failure would likely cause loss of human life, are rated as structurally deficient. Their failure modes are known. They are unaddressed. The people downstream of them have no meaningful legal protection in most jurisdictions. The Oroville Dam in California, the tallest dam in the United States, experienced a spillway failure in 2017 that forced evacuation of nearly 200,000 people. Investigation found that warning signs had been reported years earlier without triggering corrective action. California subsequently passed Senate Bill 92, strengthening dam safety review requirements. Several states have fewer than 5 dam safety inspectors responsible for hundreds of regulated structures. Inspection cycles that nominally require annual review have documented gaps of 5 to 10 years between actual inspections. Private dam owners in most states face no criminal liability for failure to perform maintenance. Only civil liability after a failure has already killed people. A legal structure that creates minimal financial incentive for preventive action. The Teton Dam failure in Idaho in 1976 killed 11 people and caused $2 billion in damage. Internal warnings about the design had not been acted upon. There's a list of dams that could kill you. The list has been available for years. Nobody with the legal authority to fix them is required to do anything about it. 8. The earthquake early warning alarm sounds. People stop what they're doing. They walk calmly to safe positions. Surgeons pause. Trains slow. The system has given you the gift of time. Several minutes at least. This is the cinematic version of earthquake early warning, and it has almost no connection to how the system actually works, how it was built, or the years of political fighting that delayed its deployment while the technology sat ready. The Shake Alert system operated by the United States Geological Survey provides warnings of 5 to 60 seconds, depending on your distance from the epicenter. Not minutes, seconds. The physics are fixed. You cannot warn people faster than seismic waves travel, and seismic waves travel very fast. Japan deployed the world's first operational earthquake early warning system in 2007, developed in the aftermath of the 1995 Great Hanshin earthquake that killed 6,434 people. The legal mandate for integrating that system into public broadcasting, rail networks, and industrial facilities was enacted specifically because stopping high-speed trains and halting automated manufacturing processes in those seconds was calculably life-saving. The window is small, but the interventions that fit inside it are well-defined and effective. California's Shake Alert public alerting rollout was delayed for years, not because the technology wasn't ready, but because the legal and political framework for sending wireless emergency alerts to cell phones, the same mechanism used for severe weather alerts, was unresolved. The technical system was functional before the legislative battles were finished. Oregon and Washington state laws now require specific critical infrastructure operators, hospitals, rail systems, utilities, to integrate automated Shake Alert response protocols. These are enforceable mandates that didn't exist before legislative action following Cascadia subduction zone risk modeling. The Drop Cover Hold On protocol now legally mandated in California. School earthquake drills replaced the doorframe seeking myth specifically after 1994. Northridge injury data showed doorframe behavior resulted in more injuries than structured desk sheltering. Mexico City's seismic alert system provides 60 to 120 seconds of warning to city residents because of the city's distance from the primary rupture zone. It was built after the 1985 earthquake killed an estimated 10,000 people and is legally integrated into school and building evacuation protocols. Whether false warnings trigger legally compensable harms remains unresolved in most U.S. jurisdictions, creating a documented chilling effect on aggressive alerting decisions. The warning gives you enough time to understand what's happening. What you do with those seconds is still mostly your problem. 9. The siren goes off and you know what it means. You have time. That's why sirens exist. To give you a window, a warning, a head start. You gather your family and move to safety. The siren will tell you when you need to hurry. What the siren will not tell you, because it was never designed to tell you, is that it was built for people who are already outside. The legal and engineering purpose of outdoor tornado warning sirens is to alert people who are outdoors so they can seek shelter. They are not indoor notification systems. FEMA's guidance states this explicitly. They are outdoor warning devices. Modern insulated construction significantly muffles their sound, and there is no consistent federal standard governing their design, placement, sound level, or maintenance. Individual municipalities make those decisions independently, producing wildly uneven coverage across even a single county. The average lead time for a tornado warning in the United States is 13 minutes. That's the average. Many significant events produce warnings with 3 to 5 minute lead times. Fast-developing satellite tornadoes can produce effective warning times of 0. After the 2011 Joplin tornado killed 161 people, the National Weather Service investigation found that many residents had heard the first siren and interpreted it as a routine weather alert rather than an imminent life threat. This finding drove significant revision to how NWS issues tornado warnings, including the creation of the Tornado Emergency language tier for the most catastrophic events, a linguistic escalation designed to break through warning fatigue. The 2011 super outbreak on April 27th killed 316 people across the Southeast, including in multiple events where warnings were issued with adequate lead time, but fatalities still concentrated in mobile homes, which provide no meaningful tornado protection regardless of warning time. Several states enacted laws after 2011 requiring mobile home parks above a certain size to provide community shelter structures, a direct legislative consequence of documented fatality patterns showing mobile home occupants dying at dramatically higher rates than those in permanent construction. Oklahoma City's history of repeated tornado strikes led to city ordinance changes requiring new construction of certain occupancy types to include below-grade sheltering. The wireless emergency alert tornado warning integration into cell phones was implemented through an FCC mandate under the Warning, Alert, and Response Network Act of 2006. The siren was built to tell people outside to go inside. It was never told that the people inside couldn't hear it. 10. Shelter in place is official guidance. It comes from emergency management professionals. You stay inside, seal your doors and windows, turn off your ventilation system, and you wait out the chemical release. It is safe. It is government approved. It has a brochure. What the brochure frequently omits is the part where shelter in place has a hard expiration time, measured in minutes. And in documented disasters, authorities maintained shelter in place orders long past the point where they were providing any protection at all. The Bhopal disaster in India in 1984 is the foundational case. Methyl isocyanate released from a Union Carbide pesticide plant killed an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people. In the immediate aftermath, residents were directed to shelter in place when evacuation was the only option with any meaningful protective value. The disaster directly reshaped international industrial hazard law and informed the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, enacted by the United States Congress in 1986. EPCRA requires industries to disclose chemical inventories to local emergency planners and surrounding communities, a legal structure that did not exist before Bhopal demonstrated what happens when people have no information about what is stored next to where they live and sleep. The 2013 West Fertilizer Company explosion in West Texas killed 15 people, including 12 emergency responders. Subsequent investigation found that the facility stored 1,340 times the threshold quantity of ammonium nitrate that would have triggered federal risk management planning requirements. It had never been subject to those requirements because of gaps in the regulatory framework. Executive Order 13-6 1950 tightened chemical facility safety law in response. The EPA's risk management program, which requires facilities above threshold chemical quantities to develop emergency response plans, was significantly strengthened after West Texas. Shelter-in-place protocols within those plans now require time limit modeling, an explicit legal acknowledgement that the protection has a clock attached to it. Shelter-in-place provides meaningful protection when a toxic release is transient and will pass before indoor air quality degrades to dangerous concentrations. In sustained releases, that degradation can occur within minutes to hours depending on building tightness. Post-Katrina, several Gulf Coast facilities released chemicals during the storm, while communities were simultaneously under shelter-in-place and hurricane evacuation orders. A legal and logistical contradiction that produced revised EPA guidance. Shelter-in-place is a real strategy with an expiration date. Nobody thought to put the expiration date on the order. 11. When disaster strikes and federal money flows, it goes to the people who lost everything. That's the point. That's what disaster relief is. The assistance reaches the most vulnerable first, because that is the moral logic of the entire system, and the moral logic of the entire system has been tested against the documented outcomes of multiple major disasters and found to be aspirational rather than operational. FEMA's Individual Assistance Program has documented denial rates exceeding 50% for initial applicants in multiple disasters. After Katrina, the Government Accountability Office found that FEMA's documentation requirements effectively screened out renters and residents in informal housing arrangements, populations disproportionately concentrated in low-income communities, because the proof of residency requirements assumed formal lease agreements that those residents did not have. The Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, the largest federal source of long-term disaster housing funds, is allocated to states with minimal federal oversight of how it is distributed to individuals. Post-Katrina and post-Harvey investigations found significant racial and income disparities in program distribution that were not illegal under the statute as written because the statute didn't prohibit them. Louisiana's Road Home program, which distributed $10.5 billion in CDBG-DR funds for home rebuilding after Katrina, used a pre-storm property value formula that produced lower grants for homeowners in lower income neighborhoods than for homeowners with identical damage in higher income areas. HUD found this formula violated civil rights law, but only after years of litigation, years during which the formula operated as designed. The Stafford Act prioritizes restoration of essential services, which in practice often means infrastructure serving economic activity rather than residential communities, a priority structure that has been litigated repeatedly. Small Business Administration disaster loans, the primary financial recovery mechanism for homeowners who don't qualify for grants, require creditworthiness, meaning the lowest income survivors are frequently ineligible for the primary tool that exists to help them. After Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico's disaster relief allocation was subject to withholding and conditions not applied to contemporaneous disasters in Texas and Florida. The disparity was documented in congressional testimony. Post-disaster tax provisions, accelerated depreciation, loss deduction carrybacks, primarily benefit property owners and businesses rather than renters and wage workers. The relief was real. So was the line. The line was not first come, first served. 12. You cannot sue the government when a natural disaster hurts you. Everyone knows this. Disasters are acts of God. The government didn't make the earthquake, didn't make the hurricane, didn't make the flood. You cannot hold a government legally responsible for what the weather does. This framing is incorrect in ways that have produced some of the most consequential infrastructure law of the past century, and understanding where it's wrong tells you more about how disaster law actually works than almost any other entry on this list. In 2009, a federal judge ruled in the Katrina Canal breaches litigation that the Army Corps of Engineers had negligently designed and maintained the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, contributing directly to the catastrophic flooding of St. Bernard Parish and the lower Ninth Ward. The ruling was later overturned on sovereign immunity grounds under the Flood Control Act of 1928, a law enacted after the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 that specifically immunized the federal government from liability for flood control project failures. That 1928 immunity provision has been litigated continuously in the century since its passage. The litigation, even when unsuccessful, forced a complete re-engineering of the New Orleans flood protection system. Pacific Gas and Electric in California paid a $13.5 billion settlement for the Camp Fire and related wildfires in which its equipment started the fires. The settlement was structured through bankruptcy court. California subsequently enacted laws imposing new requirements for utility vegetation management and equipment inspection, with civil and criminal liability attached to noncompliance. The Federal Tort Claims Act allows suits against the federal government for negligence, but includes a discretionary function exception that the government has used consistently to block disaster-related claims by arguing that emergency management decisions involve policy choices immune from judicial review. The boundaries of that exception are actively contested in current litigation. Post-Hurricane Sandy, New York and New Jersey faced litigation over inadequate storm surge protection infrastructure. Much of it was shielded by sovereign immunity, but the political pressure from filed litigation alone accelerated infrastructure investment decisions worth billions of dollars. Class action suits against PGE established that utilities operating in high fire risk zones have an affirmative legal duty to inspect and de-energize equipment during dangerous weather conditions, a duty now codified in California Public Utilities Commission regulations. You can sue. Whether you win depends entirely on whether the government already wrote the law that says it doesn't have to. 13. The television says mandatory evacuation. Mandatory. The word is not ambiguous. You are required to leave. If you stay, you will be arrested or removed, or both. The law is behind this order, with the full weight of the state. The actual legal weight behind most mandatory evacuation orders in the United States is considerably lighter than the word mandatory implies, and this gap between the announcement and the enforcement reality has shaped evacuation policy in ways that most residents in high-risk zones have never been told. Most state emergency management statutes authorize governors to issue mandatory evacuation orders, but do not grant law enforcement the authority to physically remove competent adults from their own private property against their will. The constitutional constraints of due process apply in declared emergencies. You have a right to remain in your own home, and in most U.S. states, that right survives a mandatory evacuation order with no meaningful legal consequence. South Carolina and a handful of other states have statutes that explicitly create misdemeanor criminal liability for refusing to comply with a mandatory evacuation order, but prosecutions after storms are essentially non-existent. The threat functions as a social compliance tool, not an enforcement mechanism. After Hurricane Floyd in 1999 prompted evacuation of 2.6 million people across Florida and the Carolinas, analysis of compliance patterns showed that the mandatory designation improved compliance rates compared to voluntary orders. But the improvement was driven primarily by communication quality and trust in official messaging, not by fear of legal consequences. Post-Katrina, Louisiana strengthened its emergency powers to allow more aggressive evacuation enforcement, but prosecution of property owners who sheltered in place was never pursued because the constitutional basis was too fragile to survive judicial review. The legal change was political theater more than operational capacity. The Special Needs Registry System, now legally mandated in most states, requires jurisdictions to maintain databases of residents who need evacuation assistance due to mobility impairments or medical equipment dependencies, and to have a functioning plan to evacuate them. These registries were created after post-Katrina fatality analysis showed that deaths concentrated in specific zip codes among elderly and disabled residents who had no means of self-evacuation and no system that came for them. Mandatory means the government strongly suggests this, dressed in a legal costume, and hopes you comply. 14. When a disaster is declared and the price of bottled water suddenly triples, price gouging laws kick in. They're illegal. You're protected. The law is clear. The law is, in fact, one of the most patchy and inconsistently enforced areas of consumer protection in the American legal system, and the protections that do exist have been routinely outpaced by the scale and speed of the violations they were meant to stop. There is no federal price gouging statute for consumer goods during natural disasters. The Federal Trade Commission has authority over certain commercial practices, but no general anti-price gouging mandate that activates during declared disasters. 34 states have some form of price gouging statute. 16 states have none. Identical behavior, charging 400% above normal for generators after a hurricane, can be a criminal act in one state and entirely legal in the neighboring state during the same disaster event. Florida's price gouging statute, one of the more aggressive in the country, activates automatically when a state of emergency is declared and prohibits price increases for essential commodities above gross profit percentages established in the 30 days before the emergency. It was strengthened specifically after Hurricane Andrew in 1992. After Hurricane Irma in 2017, Florida's Attorney General filed hundreds of price gouging complaints, resulting in settlements ranging from hundreds to thousands of dollars. But enforcement capacity relative to the scale of violation was documented as entirely inadequate. The law was there. The enforcement apparatus didn't scale to the problem. Post-COVID, several states that lacked price gouging statutes enacted them. The pandemic functioning as a disaster event that exposed the regulatory gap, producing new statutes in states that major hurricane seasons had never moved to act. The essential commodity definition in most statutes creates active litigation around what qualifies. Gasoline is always covered. Hotel rooms, rental housing, and contractor services after major storms have been contested in multiple jurisdictions. Post-Katrina litigation in Louisiana around contractor pricing led to expanded statutory definitions that now include emergency repair and construction services. Amazon and other large platforms have been investigated and fined in multiple states for third-party seller gouging during declared emergencies, creating the novel legal question of platform liability for marketplace pricing, a question still being resolved through new enforcement guidance. The law said you couldn't be gouged. It didn't hire enough people to stop it while you were already paying. 15. When the worst happens, FEMA comes. That's the deal. The federal government has an entire agency dedicated to disaster response, with the resources, the logistics, and the authority to respond at scale. When the big one hits, federal help arrives. The actual legal architecture of FEMA's authority is structured in a way that directly contradicts this expectation, and the gap between public perception and operational reality has been measured in both official reports and body counts. The Stafford Act, which governs virtually everything FEMA does in a disaster, establishes explicitly that disaster response is primarily a state and local responsibility. Federal assistance is supplementary. It requires a formal gubernatorial request and a presidential disaster declaration before FEMA can deploy major resources, a process that takes hours to days from initial event. The agency cannot legally act before a state asks for help. After Katrina, the congressional investigation report titled Failure of Initiative documented that FEMA's National Response Plan contained a catastrophic event annex anticipating federal prepositioning before state requests in no-notice catastrophic events, but that this authority was not invoked due to bureaucratic and political friction. The Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006 restructured FEMA with enhanced authority, a dedicated disaster reserve fund, and requirements for pre-disaster planning agreements. Critics documented that funding levels still made true federal first response capacity fictional for genuinely catastrophic scenarios. FEMA's urban search and rescue teams, the people who extract survivors from collapsed structures, consist of 28 federally sponsored task forces based at local agencies across the country. Activating and deploying them to a distant disaster takes a minimum of 6 to 24 hours. After Hurricane Maria, FEMA's response was documented in multiple investigations as catastrophically inadequate. The sequencing of Harvey and Irma before Maria had exhausted FEMA's contractor and supply capacity, and the island's geography compounded every logistical constraint. Subsequent law required FEMA to preposition more resources in the Caribbean before hurricane season. The whole community approach adopted by FEMA after 2011 explicitly shifts emphasis toward community self-sufficiency for the first 72 hours of any disaster, an acknowledgement written into official doctrine that federal rescue cannot be the expected first response. FEMA's maximum individual assistance grant is approximately $43,900 per household, regardless of actual losses. FEMA is the backup plan. It's a critical backup plan. It just works best when someone told you it was going to be backup. 16. We know where the earthquake faults are. The maps exist. The science is established. And if you're not on a designated fault line, your earthquake risk is low. That's what the maps say. And the maps are built on decades of scientific research. The maps have edges. The faults do not. And the legal disclosure requirements that should translate seismic knowledge into consumer protection are almost nowhere near complete enough to close that gap. California's Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zone Act, enacted in 1972 after the 1971 Sylmar earthquake, prohibits construction of most structures for human occupancy directly on the trace of an active fault. It is a strong law in a narrow application. It applies only to faults that have been formally mapped and designated under the Act. Unmapped active faults carry no legal protection whatsoever, and California's fault mapping, while the most extensive in the nation, is not complete. The 2014 South Napa earthquake caused $362 million in damage. The fault segment that ruptured was not a formally designated Alquist-Priolo zone. The Cascadia Subduction Zone, a 700-mile fault system capable of producing magnitude 9.0 earthquakes affecting Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, was not recognized by scientists as capable of producing great earthquakes until the 1990s, decades after cities and legal frameworks were built along its coastline. The recognition prompted major building code revision in the Pacific Northwest, but did not trigger retroactive structural requirements for the existing building stock. Oklahoma's dramatic increase in earthquake frequency during the 2010 decade, driven by wastewater injection from oil and gas operations, exposed a state that had no seismic disclosure requirements or building code provisions calibrated to earthquake risk because no one had previously anticipated it needing them. Oklahoma passed new injection well regulations after magnitude 5.0 and larger earthquakes became routine. Real estate disclosure laws regarding fault proximity vary enormously across states. California requires disclosure of Alquist-Priolo zone location. Oregon and Washington have no comparable legal requirement for Cascadia subduction zone proximity. The USGS National Seismic Hazard Model, which forms the scientific foundation for building codes, is updated approximately every 6 years and explicitly acknowledges significant uncertainty ranges. Legal codes built from that model use central estimates, not uncertainty bounds. Eastern U.S. states have essentially no seismic design provisions in their building codes, despite documented historical large earthquakes in the New Madrid seismic zone and Virginia. The map has edges. The faults don't know that. 17. There is a warning system. It detects the earthquake, calculates the wave, and sends an alert to the coast before the water arrives. People evacuate. The system works. This is accurate for one specific type of tsunami, the kind generated by a large earthquake in a distant location, giving coastal residents 30 minutes to hours to reach high ground. For the other kind, the one generated by the fault directly offshore from the community it's about to destroy. The warning system is nearly irrelevant, and the laws built around tsunami preparedness have had to reckon with that constraint through disaster after disaster. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center provides excellent warning for distant-sourced tsunamis. Japan's world-class warning system, developed specifically after the 1993 Hokkaido Nansei-Oki earthquake, demonstrated its limits in 2011. Not because it failed, but because the Tohoku earthquake generated a local source tsunami that arrived at some coastal communities within 15 to 30 minutes. Ground shaking disrupted communications in the warning window. Some warnings didn't reach coastal residents in time. Approximately 20,000 people died. For truly local source tsunamis, fault rupture immediately offshore, the first wave can arrive within 5 to 15 minutes of the earthquake. The earthquake itself is the warning. There is no automated alert mechanism that shortens warning time below the physical travel time of the wave. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami killed an estimated 227,000 people across 14 countries. The Indian Ocean had no tsunami warning system. The disaster directly led to the creation of the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System through a UNESCO-coordinated international legal framework. A system that had to be built from the ground up because the legal and institutional infrastructure simply hadn't existed. Japan revised its tsunami evacuation maps dramatically after Tohoku, after discovering that prior maps had underestimated run-up heights by 50% in some locations, meaning formally designated safe evacuation assembly points had been inundated. Oregon and Washington state law now requires tsunami inundation zone mapping to be incorporated into local land use planning, a requirement phased in over years against political resistance from coastal property interests. Washington state has funded vertical evacuation structure feasibility studies for communities where horizontal evacuation is not possible in the available time. The warning system is world-class for tsunamis coming from far away. For the one generated directly underneath you, you are your own warning system, and the clock starts with the shaking. 18. Landslides are something that happens in mountain communities, on steep terrain, in places where the geography makes the risk obvious. If you live in a suburb on a moderate slope, you don't have a landslide problem. You have a drainage issue, maybe. Landslide risk is one of the most significantly underdisclosed property hazards in the United States, affecting 46 states, and the legal disclosure requirements that would inform property buyers are essentially non-existent outside of a very small number of jurisdictions. USGS estimates that landslides cause $3.5 billion in property damage annually, and between 25 and 50 deaths per year in the United States, with the death count likely underestimated, because medical examiner records do not consistently code landslide-related fatalities as a distinct cause of death. The 2014 Oso landslide in Washington state killed 43 people. Subsequent investigation found that prior geological studies had specifically described the slope as having the most landslide-prone terrain in the Cascades, and had anticipated a large deep-seated failure. Legal proceedings established that Snohomish County possessed mapping data indicating elevated risk. The disaster led directly to Washington State's Landslide Hazard Identification and Mapping Act of 2019, among the first statewide systematic landslide mapping programs in the nation, with mandatory integration into land use planning. California requires real estate disclosure of liquefaction zones and earthquake-induced landslide zones in mapped areas. But for rainfall-induced landslides, a separate hazard category, disclosure requirements are dramatically weaker. The 2018 Montecito debris flow killed 23 people and destroyed 100 homes in an area that had just experienced the Thomas Fire. Wildfire removal of vegetation destabilized slopes that had been stable before the burn, and when a rainstorm followed, debris flows traveled at speeds that made evacuation impossible, even with warnings in place. California's post-event response included new protocols specifically for post-fire debris flow risk assessment, recognizing that fire fundamentally changes the landslide hazard profile of a landscape for years afterward. In most states, there is no legal requirement for sellers to disclose historical landslide activity on or adjacent to a property, no requirement for geotechnical investigation before residential construction on slopes below a threshold steepness, and no property tax disclosure of landslide hazard. Buyers regularly assume risk they have no mechanism for knowing exists. The mountain doesn't have to come to you. A patient slope and a rainstorm will manage it just fine. 19. Nuclear power plants are held to a higher engineering standard than any other structure on Earth. The oversight, the regulatory framework, the design review processes, they are extensive, well-funded, and administered by one of the most technically sophisticated regulatory agencies in the federal government. Nothing can take one down. This claim has been tested against actual events and found to contain a specific and recurring flaw. The design basis, the set of natural disaster scenarios a plant is legally required to survive, has repeatedly proven insufficient when actual events exceeded what the design assumed could happen. Fukushima Daiichi in 2011 is the most consequential example. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake and the tsunami it generated overwhelmed the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan. The facility had been designed to survive a 5.7-meter tsunami. The actual tsunami reached 14 meters. The design basis had been established using historical data that systematically underestimated maximum credible tsunami height, and no regulatory mechanism had required the operator to revisit that assumption when new scientific data became available. Post-Fukushima, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued Fukushima Lessons Learned regulatory orders in 2012 requiring all U.S. nuclear plants to reassess their beyond design basis flooding and seismic hazards and implement mitigations. This was the most significant post-disaster revision to U.S. nuclear safety requirements since the 3 Mile Island partial meltdown in 1979. 3 Mile Island directly caused passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 and comprehensive revision of NRC licensing procedures, one of the clearest examples of disaster-reactive regulatory lawmaking in American regulatory history. The NRC's design basis concept establishes the specific scenarios each plant must be capable of surviving, but explicitly excludes scenarios deemed too improbable, a probability threshold that has been revised upward multiple times after events that were previously classified as outside the design envelope actually occurred. The Callaway plant in Missouri and several other Midwest facilities were affected by the 1993 Mississippi River flooding. Backup diesel generators, which provide emergency cooling power in a loss of offsite power scenario, had been designed to the 100-year flood level. Post-Fukushima NRC orders required reevaluation of that assumption across the fleet. The plant was designed to survive what engineers thought the worst case looked like. Nature has not read those engineering documents, and it has shown no particular interest in doing so. 20. Fire breaks are the established tool for stopping wildfires. Clear a strip of land, remove the fuel, and the fire stops at the break. It's been used for generations. It's built into land management law and practice, and it works. Fire breaks work under specific conditions. Under the extreme fire weather conditions that produce mass casualty events, they are nearly irrelevant to the outcome, and the legal frameworks built around fuel management have in documented cases created a false confidence that delayed the recognition of how dramatically fire behavior had changed. Under moderate wind, moderate humidity, and normal fuel moisture, a properly constructed fuel break can slow or stop fire spread. Under extreme fire weather, low humidity, high wind, critically low fuel moisture, the combination now documented with increasing frequency across the western United States. Fire spotting carries embers miles ahead of the main fire line. No fuel break stops a spot fire that ignites a quarter mile beyond it. The 2018 Camp Fire generated spot fires more than a mile beyond the primary fire front within minutes of igniting. The fire jumped multiple fuel breaks. The fatalities were not caused by the failure of fuel management law. They were caused by fire behavior that exceeded the operational assumptions on which that law was built. Australia's Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, convened after the 2019 to 2020 Black Summer fires, documented that prescribed burning programs, the large-scale legal application of fuel management, had not been conducted at sufficient frequency or scale to meaningfully alter catastrophic fire behavior under extreme atmospheric conditions. Even recently treated landscapes sustained fire spread because it was wind and ember transport, not fuel load, that governed the event. California's Assembly, Bill 38, requires home sellers to provide defensible space compliance documentation for properties in high fire risk zones, applying fuel management logic at the individual parcel level. It is a meaningful requirement. It cannot protect a structure from a firebrand shower in campfire type conditions. California's subsequent home hardening legislative push. Assembly Bill 2178 and related legislation requires ignition-resistant construction materials for new development in high-risk zones, a legal shift in focus from landscape to structure that reflects the lesson that fuel management alone is not enough. Insurance market withdrawal from California has itself become a driver of legislative change. The fire break stops the fire you planned for. The fire doesn't always cooperate with the plan. 21. If your tap water is gone after a disaster and you can find a stream, boiling it makes it safe. People have been doing this for all of human history. It removes the biological hazard. You drink, you survive. Boiling water addresses biological contamination with complete effectiveness. It does nothing whatsoever about industrial chemicals, heavy metals, pharmaceutical runoff, and hydrocarbon contamination, the specific categories of post-disaster water hazard that exist in developed urban environments, and that have produced some of the most significant and legally consequential water safety failures in recent American history. After Hurricane Harvey in 2017, more than 800 industrial facilities reported to the EPA that they had released regulated substances, including benzene and vinyl chloride, into floodwaters that subsequently mixed with groundwater and municipal water systems across the Houston region. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality faced significant documented criticism for not proactively testing private wells in affected areas after those releases were reported. Post-Katrina flooding in New Orleans created a mixture of industrial, agricultural, and sewage contamination across residential areas. Soil and water testing in the lower Ninth Ward found elevated heavy metal levels that persisted for years. Louisiana environmental law was pressured through subsequent litigation and legislative advocacy to require faster post-disaster environmental assessment, with partial results. The Flint, Michigan water crisis of 2014 and 2015, triggered by a cost-cutting decision during a fiscal emergency rather than a natural disaster, but operating through identical infrastructure vulnerability, resulted in elevated blood lead levels in children and produced the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act, with specific provisions for lead pipe replacement and community water system oversight. Post-wildfire drinking water contamination is now a recognized and studied category of disaster hazard. The 2018 Camp Fire contaminated Paradise's municipal water system with benzene and other volatile organic compounds from the thermal breakdown of plastic pipes during the fire. Concentrations exceeded safe drinking water standards for months. California water boards subsequently developed specific post-wildfire distribution system assessment protocols. The EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act protections apply to public water systems. Private wells serving approximately 43 million Americans are largely unregulated at the federal level and receive no mandatory post-disaster water quality testing in most states. The World Health Organization's Emergency Water Safety Guidance explicitly distinguishes biological from chemical water hazards and notes that heat treatment addresses the first category and not the second. Boiling water makes it biologically safer. It doesn't care about the benzene. 22, you have home insurance. Home insurance covers disasters. Your home is covered. When the earthquake destroys it, you file a claim. This is such a natural assumption that millions of homeowners in the most seismically active regions in the United States have carried it for decades without ever reading the exclusions in their policy. And the legal framework surrounding earthquake insurance was specifically constructed around the reality that most people make exactly this assumption and are completely wrong. Standard homeowners insurance policies in the United States explicitly exclude earth movement as a covered peril. This is not a technicality or a loophole. It is a foundational feature of the standard policy form that has been in place for decades, and it is not prominently disclosed in most insurance marketing. Earthquake coverage requires a separate policy or endorsement, and most people don't buy it. California created the California Earthquake Authority in 1996 after the Northridge earthquake triggered a near collapse of the state's private earthquake insurance market. Insurers who had been legally required to offer earthquake coverage under California law began withdrawing from the homeowners insurance market entirely to avoid earthquake exposure. The California Earthquake Authority was created as a publicly managed insurance pool to take on that risk and stabilize the market. Approximately 13% of California homeowners currently carry earthquake insurance. That means 87% of homeowners in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth have no coverage for what is likely their most catastrophic potential property loss. Post-Northridge analysis found that insured losses totaled approximately $12.5 billion, while total losses were estimated between $20 and $44 billion. The gap represents uninsured private losses recoverable only through FEMA grants, which are capped and income qualified, and SBA disaster loans, which require creditworthiness. Pacific Northwest states have even lower earthquake insurance take-up rates than California, despite facing Cascadia subduction zone risk that would dwarf any historical California event. Japan's earthquake insurance system is a public-private partnership established by the Earthquake Insurance Law of 1966 after the 1964 Niigata earthquake. Coverage is mandatory alongside fire insurance for residential properties at subsidized rates, producing dramatically higher take-up than the U.S. voluntary market model. In a major earthquake scenario, post-disaster recovery in the United States would fall almost entirely on federal programs legally structured to provide a fraction of actual losses. Your home insurance has the earthquake exclusion. You just probably didn't read the exclusion. The exclusion is the whole ballgame. 23. When the president declares a major disaster, the machinery of federal response activates and help flows. Resources move. People get assistance. The declaration unlocks the system. The declaration is a legally necessary piece of paperwork that initiates a process requiring additional legally necessary pieces of paperwork before anything actually reaches the people who just lost everything. That sequence has been the subject of multiple congressional investigations, and the political anatomy of how declarations are granted has been documented in peer-reviewed research that is uncomfortable reading for anyone who believes disaster assistance is administered purely on the basis of need. The Stafford Act requires a gubernatorial request and a presidential declaration before FEMA can deploy major resources. The governor must formally document that state resources are exhausted. The process includes a preliminary damage assessment that requires federal-state coordination. The average time between a disaster event and a declaration for major events during the 2010s was 8 to 16 days. Professors Andrew Reeves and Thomas Garrett published research documenting a statistically significant correlation between disaster declaration rates and the presidential electoral competitiveness of affected states. Competitive states received declarations at higher rates than non-competitive states with comparable damage. This is not an allegation of criminal corruption. It is a documented structural feature of a politically administered relief system in which the declaration decision rests entirely with one elected official. Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico on September the 20th, 2017. A declaration was issued the same day. The bureaucratic mobilization of adequate federal resources lagged the declaration by weeks in documented ways. A Congressional Research Service report found that FEMA had exhausted contractor and supply capacity from Harvey and Irma, and that the Stafford Act's administrative framework contained no mechanism to rapidly replenish those resources. After the declaration is issued, FEMA's individual assistance registration still requires survivors to submit applications, provide documentation, receive an inspection, and await eligibility determination. A process documented to take weeks to months, while displaced families need immediate housing. Post-Katrina reform created the National Response Framework specifically to pre-organize federal agency roles before declarations, reducing the standing-up time for response. It did not eliminate the fundamental administrative timeline bottlenecks in the Stafford Act. Several states have created pre-positioned disaster contracts and mutual aid compacts specifically because they recognized that federal declaration timelines are operationally inadequate for the initial 72-hour response window. The declaration is the paperwork saying, help is coming. The paperwork and the help are on separate timelines. 24. Hospitals are the safest buildings in a disaster. They are the buildings you go toward when everything else has failed. They are heavily regulated, structurally robust, continuously staffed, and designed to function under pressure. They are where civilization puts its most important resources when things go wrong. Hospitals in high-hazard zones have lost structural integrity, lost power, lost water, and become physically inaccessible during the disasters when they were most critically needed. And the laws requiring hospital resilience were written almost entirely after specific hospitals failed in specific disasters and specific people died. The 1971 Sylmar earthquake in California killed 47 patients and 2 nurses when the Olive View Medical Center and a Veterans Administration hospital collapsed. This event directly prompted California's Alfred E. Alquist Hospital Facilities Seismic Safety Act in 1972, imposing seismic safety standards on hospitals that did not apply to other building types, the first such law in the United States. California's subsequent identification that many hospitals built before 1973 could not meet the new standards produced decades of political negotiation about retrofit timelines. Senate Bill 1953, enacted in 1994 after Northridge, established mandatory retrofit or replacement deadlines with final compliance dates for the most critical structural requirements extending to 2030, 59 years after the law that made the requirements necessary. During Hurricane Katrina, Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans lost power and water and was inaccessible for 5 days. 45 patients died. Subsequent legal proceedings examined whether medical decisions made under those conditions constituted criminal conduct, triggering legal scrutiny that Louisiana and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services used to revise emergency preparedness requirements for healthcare facilities. The CMS Emergency Preparedness Rule of 2016 requires all Medicare and Medicaid certified facilities to maintain emergency operations plans with specific elements including backup utility systems, patient evacuation procedures, and communication redundancy. It is a federally enforceable condition of participation in Medicare and Medicaid programs, with loss of certification as the consequence for non-compliance. The 2011 Joplin tornado destroyed St. John's Regional Medical Center mid-operation. 183 patients were evacuated in 90 minutes in an improvised operation that became a model for disaster response planning. Missouri subsequently revised its healthcare facility emergency plan requirements in response. The hospital will try to be there for you. Whether the building cooperates is a question someone should have asked earlier. 25. Your cell phone is your lifeline in an emergency. The network is everywhere. It's robust. It was engineered to handle demand. And in your worst moment, you will pick it up and it will work. Cellular networks fail during major disasters with enough consistency and enough predictability that the legal requirements governing network resilience have been revised after multiple documented catastrophic failures. And those revisions still haven't solved the fundamental problem that the network depends on power that disasters reliably remove. The FCC documented that Hurricane Maria knocked out approximately 95% of cell towers in Puerto Rico. Service was not restored to pre-storm levels for weeks to months. The island's significant reliance on cellular networks, with limited landline infrastructure as an alternative, meant that the communications outage was nearly complete. Post-Katrina, the FCC substantially strengthened its network outage reporting system to improve data collection on disaster-related network failures. The collected data showed that battery backup on cell towers, typically 4 to 8 hours, was entirely inadequate for multi-day power outages, which are a standard outcome in major hurricane landfalls. The FCC proposed extended backup power requirements. The proposal faced significant industry resistance. The First Responder Network Authority, FirstNet, was created by the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 to build a dedicated nationwide broadband network for first responders, a direct legislative response to communication failures on September 11, 2001, when first responders could not communicate across agencies, compounded by Hurricane Katrina's demonstration that commercial network failure leaves emergency services without communications at the moment they need it most. During the 2018 Kilauea volcanic eruption in Hawaii, wireless 911 service in affected areas was disrupted, leading FEMA and the FCC to develop additional guidance on 911 resilience for geologically active areas. Network congestion, degradation from simultaneous call volume rather than physical infrastructure failure, is documented in every major urban disaster. After the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, cell service was degraded across the city from call volume alone. Carriers subsequently invested in surge capacity protocols. The text to 911 rollout was partly motivated by the fact that text messages are less vulnerable to congestion than voice calls. The FCC mandated carrier support by 2014. Your phone works great right up until the moment you actually need it to work. That's not a bug. It's an engineering decision that nobody told you about. 26. The main earthquake hits. Aftershocks follow. Everyone says they'll diminish. They're just the earth settling into its new arrangement. The worst is over. Go back inside and start assessing the damage. The damage assessment you conduct inside a structure weakened by the main event during an aftershock sequence that has not finished has produced documented fatalities in multiple countries, and the legal standard for reoccupancy after earthquakes was specifically shaped by the deaths that resulted from exactly this pattern. The 2010 to 2011 Canterbury earthquake sequence in New Zealand is the case that changed the international conversation. The September 2010 Darfield earthquake, magnitude 7.1, caused extensive structural damage across the Canterbury region, but killed no one. The February 2011 Christchurch earthquake, technically a separate event in the same sequence, magnitude 6.3, killed 185 people. A significant portion of those deaths occurred in buildings that had been reoccupied after initial inspection following the September event. The structures had been further weakened by the first quake, and the second finished what the first had started. The Christchurch disaster led directly to the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act of 2011, which established legal authority to purchase and clear land in formally designated red zones, areas deemed too seismically risky for continued residential use. This was a legal mechanism for acknowledging that some damage cannot be repaired, and some locations should not be rebuilt, an acknowledgement that disaster law rarely reaches. USGS aftershock probability models, now released publicly within hours of significant earthquakes, were developed partly to provide a scientific basis for making re-entry decisions. The legal authority to restrict access based on those probabilistic models is inconsistently applied across U.S. jurisdictions. Post-Northridge, California's rapid building assessment forms under the ATC 20 protocol were standardized to explicitly account for aftershock risk. Inspectors are trained to understand that a building that survives the main event may not survive a comparable aftershock. The earthquake that weakened the building and the aftershock that brought it down are two parts of one event. The inspection was conducted in the interval between them. Several jurisdictions now legally require re-inspection of buildings after significant aftershocks, a requirement that didn't exist in most codes before Christchurch demonstrated why it should. The main earthquake weakened the building. The aftershock didn't know the building was supposed to be done falling. 27. Wildfire smoke is unpleasant. It smells, it stings, visibility drops, and it's generally a miserable experience. But it's smoke from trees and brush. It's natural, it passes, and healthy adults can tolerate the temporary discomfort without serious health consequences. The health effects of wildfire smoke exposure have been documented in peer-reviewed literature with enough clarity that regulatory guidance has been revised multiple times, and the legal framework around worker protection and public health alerts has been specifically updated after fire seasons that expose the gap between unpleasant and measurably dangerous. Fine particulate matter at PM 2.5 levels, the size fraction that wildfire smoke generates in enormous quantities, penetrates deep into lung tissue and enters the bloodstream. Peer-reviewed studies have linked short-term wildfire smoke exposure in otherwise healthy adults to increased risk of heart attack, cardiac arrhythmia, and stroke. These effects are not limited to people with pre-existing respiratory or cardiovascular conditions. The EPA's Air Quality Index is calibrated for chronic ambient air pollution sources, and the EPA has documented that the AQI unhealthy threshold may underestimate health impacts from wildfire smoke specifically, because the chemical composition of wildfire PM 2.5 differs from the industrial pollution sources used to establish the health-based thresholds in the first place. After the 2020 California wildfire season, when 4.25 million acres burned, the worst in recorded state history, the EPA revised its wildfire smoke guidance, and several California air quality districts implemented enhanced alerting systems supplementing standard AQI with wildfire-specific health communications. When structures burn, wildfire smoke includes combustion products of synthetic materials, plastics, treated wood, asbestos, containing materials in older buildings, and electronics that are absent from timber-only burns. California public health guidance after the Camp Fire explicitly addressed the distinct toxicity of structural fire smoke as a separate category from woodland fire smoke. Washington and Oregon implemented new wildfire smoke emergency action plans for outdoor workers after the 2017 and 2018 fire seasons. Cal, OSHA, and Oregon OSHA regulations now require provision of N95 respirators to outdoor workers when AQI exceeds specific thresholds during wildfire smoke events. The long-term health effects of repeated annual wildfire smoke exposure seasons are not fully characterized. Ongoing epidemiological research is examining cumulative burden in populations now experiencing weeks of unhealthy air quality annually. The air is natural. What was in the house that burned wasn't. 28. If a tornado is coming and you can't reach a basement, get to a doorway. It's structurally stronger than the surrounding wall. Get in the doorframe and hold on. This advice has been repeated so many times and by so many people that it has acquired the weight of established safety protocol. FEMA, the National Weather Service, and the American Red Cross all explicitly state that doorways offer no special protection during a tornado. The myth persists not because anyone has demonstrated it works, but because it sounds architecturally logical, and architectural logic and tornado engineering are two different disciplines. The structural failure mode in a major tornado is not a scenario where the doorframe survives and the surrounding house disintegrates neatly around it. It is whole structure failure, roof uplift, wall collapse, and complete loss of structural integrity. In an EF3 or above tornado, the exterior walls of a standard wood frame house will fail, and a door frame embedded in those walls fails with them. Wind-borne debris, which is the primary cause of tornado injury and death for people not directly under structural collapse, is not stopped by a door frame. The current recommended protective position for people without basement access is an interior room on the lowest floor, away from windows and exterior walls, with as many walls between you and the exterior as possible. After the 2011 tornado season, the deadliest since 1953, research by the Storm Prediction Center and National Weather Service documented that a significant proportion of interior room fatalities occurred in structures too lightly built to provide meaningful protection against major tornadoes. This finding drove policy discussion about whether residential construction in tornado-prone areas should include mandatory safe rooms. FEMA's Safe Room Program provides engineering specifications under the P320 and P361 guidelines requiring survivability in an EF5 tornado event. Federal grant programs have funded community safe room installation, particularly in manufactured housing communities. Oklahoma City's Community Shelter Ordinance, requiring new multifamily residential construction above certain density thresholds to include FEMA 361 safe rooms, was a direct legislative response to repeated catastrophic tornado events in the metropolitan area, one of the most aggressive municipal tornado shelter mandates in the country. Mobile homes, which are among the most dangerous structures to be in during a tornado, housed approximately 17.7 million Americans as of the 2020 census. Legal requirements for mobile home park community shelters vary dramatically by state. The doorframe is load-bearing right up until there's no load left for it to bear. 29 emergency preparedness kits, the 72-hour food and water supply, the flashlights, the batteries, are a friendly government suggestion. Optional advice from agencies trying to be helpful. The government will show up if something truly catastrophic happens. The preparedness kit is a nice idea. The legal reality of emergency preparedness in the United States is a two-tier system. For individuals, it is largely a recommendation. For hospitals, nursing homes, dialysis centers, schools, and businesses above certain thresholds, it is a legally enforceable compliance requirement with documented penalties for non-compliance, and that distinction has never been clearly communicated to the public that is being asked to take it seriously. The CMS Emergency Preparedness Rule of 2016 requires all Medicare and Medicaid certified providers, hospitals, nursing homes, dialysis centers, home health agencies, and all other certified facilities to maintain emergency preparedness plans with specific supply and communication requirements. Non-compliance risks loss of CMS certification, which for most healthcare facilities is an existential financial consequence. California's Assembly Bill 2310, enacted in 2018, requires long-term care facilities to develop and maintain individualized emergency evacuation plans for each resident. It was born from documented disasters where nursing home residents died due to inadequate evacuation planning, including the Florida nursing home deaths after Hurricane Irma, where loss of air conditioning caused fatalities among residents who were never evacuated from a facility without power for days. OSHA requires employers with more than 10 employees to maintain a written emergency action plan, a legally enforceable emergency preparedness requirement carrying civil penalties for non-compliance that applies to virtually every mid-size and large employer in the country, largely unknown to the employees it nominally protects. California's mandatory earthquake preparedness requirements for schools, including drills, emergency supplies maintained on campus, and structural assessment requirements, are codified in education code and enforced with legal accountability. FEMA's whole community approach explicitly builds a 72-hour, self-sufficiency expectation for households into the resource planning framework for how federal assistance is sequenced. While not enforceable against individuals, the 72-hour window is the foundational assumption of the entire federal response architecture. Florida's Senate Bill 7028, enacted in 2018 after the Rehabilitation Center at Hollywood Hills deaths during Irma, requires residential care facilities to maintain generator fuel supply and temperature control contingency plans. For individuals, it's a suggestion. For hospitals, nursing homes, schools, and businesses, it's a compliance test with a failing grade attached. 30. Disasters produce psychological damage alongside physical damage, and the psychological damage can wait while the physical emergency is managed. Food, water, shelter, those are the priorities. Mental health support is a long-term concern. It will be addressed in the recovery phase. It has time. Post-disaster suicide rates and substance-related mortality increase significantly in affected communities, and this pattern has been documented with enough consistency and enough specificity that it has been translated into legal frameworks governing crisis response that were simply absent before specific disasters demonstrated the cost of the delay. The Robert T. Stafford Act's Crisis, Counseling Assistance and Training Program funds short-term crisis counseling in post-declared disasters. It is a legal mechanism, activated through disaster declarations, reflecting congressional recognition that mental health response is part of emergency response. It was created in 1974 and expanded through successive amendments following major disasters. Post-Katrina New Orleans showed suicide rates that tripled in the 18 months after the storm. Post-Maria Puerto Rico documented similar patterns. These findings directly inform the policy argument for immediate mental health resource deployment as part of the initial response, not the recovery phase. Disaster behavioral health, integrating mental health and substance use services into emergency operations, became a formalized federal framework through Sam HSA's Disaster Technical Assistance Center, established after September 11th. 2001 demonstrated that mass casualty events require immediate psychological crisis response. California's Senate Bill 1113 requires that mental health services be specifically included in county disaster plans as a coordinated element of emergency response infrastructure, not an afterthought. First responders face documented elevated rates of PTSD, depression, and suicide following disaster deployments. Workers' compensation coverage for PTSD is recognized in an increasing number of states, representing a legal evolution from occupational stoicism as expectation to occupational injury as recognized claim. FEMA's individual crisis counseling model deploys trained counselors to community locations rather than requiring survivors to seek services independently, because research showed that disaster survivors with the highest need were least likely to initiate contact with formal mental health services. The James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act of 2010 covers PTSD and depression as compensable conditions for first responders and survivors with documented World Trade Center exposure. Physical injuries have an obvious billing code. Grief, terror, and the complete dismantling of your world need one too. It just took a few disasters to get the paperwork filed. 31, the disaster happens. We suffer, we rebuild, and we apply the lessons we learned. The rebuilt version is better. We don't repeat the same mistakes because we paid too high a price to pay it again. The documented pattern across virtually every major natural disaster in every country across multiple decades is that communities rebuild to the pre-disaster standard or marginally above it in the same location with the same underlying vulnerabilities. Because the political and economic forces that govern the original development almost always govern the reconstruction, and the laws that would break that cycle are almost never enacted with sufficient force to to overcome them. The 1900 Galveston hurricane killed an estimated 6,000 to 12,000 people, the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Galveston rebuilt behind a seawall and raised its grade. The lesson was partially applied. Subsequent development along vulnerable Gulf Coast areas proceeded for a century under building codes that remained inadequate until specific disasters forced revision. New Orleans rebuilt largely in its pre-storm footprint after Katrina. FEMA flood maps were revised, but the political resistance to map revisions that increase insurance costs is quantifiably documented in flood map appeals data across the Gulf Coast. Repetitive loss properties, defined by the National Flood Insurance Program as properties with 2 or more flood claims of at least $1,000 within a 10-year period. Number in the tens of thousands in the NFIP portfolio. Federal law includes provisions for buying out repetitive loss properties. Funding is limited. Participation is voluntary. Many repeatedly flooded properties continue to receive federally subsidized flood insurance and rebuild after each qualifying event. Paradise, California, voted to rebuild after the Camp Fire in 2019. Reconstruction has been slow, constrained by insurance availability, contractor shortages, and soil contamination concerns. The rebuilt community is being built in the same wildland-urban interface zone where the original community was destroyed. California law now requires more fire-resistant construction, but does not prohibit rebuilding in the location. The National Flood Insurance Program has been documented by fiscal watchdogs and environmental researchers as creating a perverse incentive structure. Federally subsidized insurance for flood-prone properties reduces the financial signal that would otherwise discourage rebuilding where the flood will return. Reform has been repeatedly proposed and partially implemented. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the international policy framework running from 2015 to 2030, to which the United States is a signatory, calls specifically for reconstruction that reduces future risk rather than replicates pre-disaster vulnerability. We know what we should do. We consistently don't do it. We didn't learn the lesson. We paid tuition, got the diploma, and walked back into the same building. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.